Welcome to Solitary Nation. My name is Matt Duhamel, where we talk about a variety of issues regarding the criminal justice system in America, prison issues, probation, sex offender issues, and that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today with my guest, Professor Lisa Sample from the University of Nebraska in Omaha. Thanks, Lisa, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Well, we have quite a few, you've actually written quite a few articles and research papers. And just before we went on camera, we were talking about one that talks about, and I've never heard this word before, but it's desistance from sex offending. And maybe you can explain that to our viewers and what that term means, first of all.
Certainly. Desistance from sex offending is a process. So what you have over time are people who come to see themselves differently, see their actions differently, and they actually embrace a more crime-free life as their own self-image changes and their awareness of their own crimes and their motivations for those crimes change. So in other words, a lot of times we talk about sex offending deterrence in terms of law, and we will put these laws out there, and hopefully that will deter future offending. And that is not to be confused with the desistance process, which is something that, you know, laws may be able to stimulate, and deterrence may be part of desistance. But it is a process of offenders coming to see themselves differently. They see themselves as non-offending individuals. They have made choices that there's something in life more valuable to them than the crimes that they committed, and they don't ever want to commit those crimes again for fear that they will lose what it is that they have achieved.
It's fascinating. It seems to me like it would be the opposite, where they may feel so isolated from the normal community, where they see themselves as not as a group or accepted, but just more like, I saw in an article, moral, like a moral leper of society.
Yes, we have a friend of mine, Chris Dunn, labels that as social refugees. And basically that's what our thought was, that these people would be rather isolated and sort of alone, and in some way that would probably affect their behavior in a negative fashion. But I have been doing a study over time since starting around 2009 with people who have not reoffended sexually. They were convicted of a sex crime and they have been out for years and have not reoffended sexually. And I started asking them the reasons why that was. And most of the time they talked to me about their ability to form support networks, social support networks. And although they're isolated from society at large, they have been able to find groups that accept them for who they are, that they did a bad thing, but that doesn't make them necessarily a bad person.
I'm glad you put it that way. And I don't know, maybe you would disagree, but maybe 10 or 15 years ago, 20 years ago, there wouldn't be support groups like there are today that can help people with a sex offense.
No, in fact, it's really sort of new. There are these things that are popping up while offenders are on probation called circles of support. And research has just started coming out with the effects of circles of support. So although that they can be segregated to some degree from say, the people in the community who are not registered sex offenders. Those people who are registered are coming together, and they have chat rooms, and they have groups that they adhere to, and they are lobbying for reasonable sex offender law reform. And they have found actually some support among people like me in the academic world, where we're actually interested in what they have to say. And again, what was unexpected is how therapeutic it was for them to just sit and tell us their stories.
I want to get more into the study here, and it's titled Nebraska's Laws Harm to Families, and that would, of course, be in regards to the sex offender registration. One of the things, and that was done by you, of course, and Danielle Bailey. Beyond the above, however, registered sex offenders still report experiencing job loss, social harassment, home displacement, law enforcement harassment, which you wouldn't think that happens, but it does, I guess, and some property vandalism as a result of their placement on the public sex offender registry. So that's just one of several dozens, rather, points that you've made. Can you tell me just a brief summary of how this paper and research came about?
Sure. It was through those interviews that I was telling you about, when we have a lot of survey research that we did a few years back, asking people who are on the registry, had they lost a job and things like that. And of course, it was survey research, so it was a lot of yes, no kinds of answers. What I was trying to do, what a lot of my students like Danielle Bailey was trying to do, was move beyond the yes, no, these things have happened to me, and get more in detail of not only what happened describe what happened to them, but how did they feel about it? How did they internalize it? How did they cope with it? And so the study that we did, particularly with sex offenders, led to a lot of them talking to us about how their wives felt, and how their children felt, and how their parents felt about having a loved one on the public registry.
Because we know now for a long time that it doesn't just affect the registered sex offender, it affects the families, and you talked about that in the study here about spouses, partners, children of sex offenders, how the registrant can't, in a lot of cases, go to school. Some cases they can, it depends. But it has that collateral damage. Maybe you can speak to that a little bit more.
Sure. It affected why. I mean, we had done surveys of families, and they said that they had also experienced wives and children harassment and things like that. But what we weren't expected to hear was how much registration laws create a single parent situation. And so even though you have a man and a woman in the same home, and both of them are trying to raise their child, because of sex offender laws, such as you can't be within so many feet of a school, you can't be within so many feet of a public park, what's happened is it's kind of forced the spouses or partners of registrants to be this kind of sole parent, if you will. They're the only ones that can attend school functions. They're the only ones that can drop their kids off at the YMCA for swimming. They're the only ones that can attend the school play and parent-teacher conferences and things. And so what we didn't see in our previous surveys that we found now is that this single parenthood is placing an incredible amount of stress on the registrant spouse or partner or live-in or cohabitant, and that stress affects their ability to continue to support their family and themselves and their sex offender loved ones.
So where's the balance between the public safety, which law enforcement and the corrections want, versus trying to live a normal life with your family? Is there a balance there? Do you see it happening now after how many years after the Jacob Wetterling Act and Megan's Law? And Adam Walsh Act?
In my field, the majority of the literature suggests that the registration and notification laws have not had a discernible effect on sexual recidivism. And so many of my scholars come down along the line that we are actually creating more harm than good by continuing these laws. And particularly after 2006, when we passed Adam Walsh Act, and so many of these laws apply to convicted sex offenders retroactively, people who had been off the registry list and then were forced to be put back on.
So it seems to be there's this battle between educational people like yourself, professors, research scholars, versus, I don't want to say it's like a war, but versus the criminal justice system. Are politicians not listening to the research being provided and being made public?
Hopefully that is changing over time. When I started doing research in this area back in 1998, I interviewed Illinois legislators because they were passing a lot of sex offender law, and in some cases they already had it. They were just passing more. And when I was talking to them, most of them responded that they were making an effort to show the community that they were concerned about a sex offending problem and that they were doing something to fix it. Here in my state of Nebraska, where I work today, they are questioning the efficacy of a lot of these laws. And they have done so quietly, and I have given them information, and it has been received favorably. But it is very difficult for a legislative body to come out and say, hey, we're going to loosen up sex offender laws for a while.
So, you know what that would cause?
Yeah.
That would cause a storm of panic, and, parents would just go crazy. I mean, I'm not saying there's not people out there that need to be watched, but as you'd mentioned, Lisa, that the list has grown beyond really what it was intended for, and now we've got so many different types of people mixed into one group. We don't know what's going on. That's what my opinion is.
Well, and when we started, a lot of states, when they started their registries, they were risk-based systems. So while everybody convicted of a sex crime was on the registry, they only made it into the public notification list if they were at high risk for reoffending. And so everybody was kind of comfortable with that, law enforcement and whatnot. And then when the Adam Walsh Act passed in 2006, and retroactively, it added a different tier system based on crime type and not risk levels. And so when we went to a crime type model, it instantly enlarged sex offender registries across the country and created this national sex offender registry into a huge thing. I mean, an incredibly costly, huge thing. So I believe to date, many states are looking at returning to what we had prior to 2006, which is that risk-based system. And really, in terms of public safety, trying to keep surveillance and monitoring activities on those people we believe are at most risk for reoffending.
One of the things in your report here, which is, I don't know if you have examples of this, but this kind of just surprises me, the harassment by law enforcement. So this is consequences of registration and notification. The harassment by law enforcement perceived by registrants and their family members when registering or during compliance check continues to vary across offenders and jurisdictions over time. Have you, from the people that you interviewed, were they or have they been experiencing harassment by the local enforcement,
Well, it's their perception, yes. And I can only talk about the study that I'm conducting here in Nebraska. But for example, when they go in to register in some counties, they will sit there and somebody will come up and get them and move them into the room to register. And they will leave quietly and everything is fine and no one will know what they were there for. And then in other counties, they come in and they sit in the waiting room and law enforcement officer will come out and say, sex offenders, ready to register.
Are you serious?
Yes.
Out in the public? Yes, waiting room?
They feel outed in the waiting room. Wives, a particularly interesting problem that we didn't anticipate among wives, is that the wives that have chosen to stay with their registered sex offender husbands, when law enforcement come to their home to we call them compliance checks, to make sure that they live where they have registered and say they live. You know, when wives open the door, they perceive that they're being treated, they're being belittled, if you will, by law enforcement. They're being asked a lot of questions by law enforcement in terms of how can you stay with that man? How can you possibly love somebody that did such horrible things? In some cases, they've even talked about prosecutors who wanted to prosecute the wives for being complicit in the sex offending that occurred, because how could you possibly live in that house and not know it was going on? So the wives could really feel sort of persecuted by a lack of empathy for them, or this they feel disrespect that they get from law enforcement and other criminal justice professionals simply because they chose to stay. I
wrote a blog recently on the website metamorphfilms.org, and I talked about the moral panics in the United States. So over the years, over the centuries, and would you go as far as saying that this is kind of a new moral panic in America?
Oh, I wouldn't call it new. We have been through them before. We went through one in the late 1930s, and several states, as a result, passed sexual psychopath laws, right around 38 to 1940. And then it kind of mellowed out for a little bit. And then the 1950s, we went through another panic, if you will, about homosexuality and the degree to which homosexuality was a sex crime, and particularly against children. And then that sort of abated for a little while. And then in 1986, we had the McMartin daycare case, which was the case where in this daycare, it was believed that children were being used in occult type of rituals and sexually assaulted in that way. And from 1986 forward, it just, at least through 2000, it just became a plethora of sex offender legislation, and in some cases that already existed, but they felt so strongly about it they needed to pass it again. And then I was just reading a piece by a colleague of mine, Christina Mancini, and she's looking at sex offendings not in terms of a moral panic as much, but rather in terms of a witch hunt. Mm. And she is basing her ideas off a beautifully written book called Wayward Puritans by Kai Erikson, and which was about the Salem and their creation of witch hunts. And she's applying that to how sex offender legislation is proliferated across the country. So instead of calling it a moral panic, she's looking at it more as a witch hunt.
Which seems to be a little more intense.
Exactly.
Yes. Well, we are running out of time, Lisa. I just want to give you a few minutes to kind of talk briefly about the organization you work with. It's the Sexual Offense Policy Research. You can find it online at sopresearch.org.
It's a brand new organization that just started 2 years ago, so we're still developing, and our website is still under construction in many places, but it is a group of scholars who've come together, and we have studied sex offense law for quite a while. And we started studying it at a time where most people in criminology were really not studying a lot of criminal justice policy. And so we came together after a couple professional meetings, and we said, hey, there's enough of us out here now. We're really studying a lot of the same things. Let's get together. Let's collaborate. Let's look at what each other are doing. And I have resources in Nebraska. A colleague of mine has some resources in Arkansas. Others have resources in Florida. And rather than just keep publishing pieces a state at a time, let's see if we can't collaborate our efforts in some way and provide better information so they can have better informed policy.
Great work.
Thank you.
Much needed work. Professor Lisa Sample, thank you so much for being on Solitary Nation this evening. I really appreciate your time. Anything else you want to say briefly?
Thank you very much for bringing attention to a topic that most people don't talk about a lot.
Oh, no problem. Thank you very much. Thank you again, Lisa Sample. And join us next next week, next Tuesday, for another episode of Solitary Nation, where we talk about incarceration and the criminal justice system in America. Thank you.